Hi, I'm delighted to welcome you to the first of a philosophy department webinar series that we're running this semester. We're calling it Practical Philosophy, and the goals of the webinar are to have members of our department discuss pressing moral and political issues that give rise to significant philosophical questions. Our goal is not to tell people what they should think about certain topics, but provide tools for thinking about them in the way that philosophers who are working on these topics have started to think about them. So in addition to today's presentation, there's going to be two more presentations this semester. So on February 29th, Piers Norris Turner will discuss the question of how we can promote civil discourse on campus. And on April 18th, Professor Tristram Macpherson will discuss the matter of how to think about consumers' ethical relationships to large-scale wrongs. Okay, so I'm extremely pleased to introduce my friend and colleague, Professor Dana Howard. Dana is a member of the faculty in philosophy and holds a primary appointment at the university's Center for Bioethics. Prior to coming to OSU, she did her doctoral work at Brown University and also held a postdoctoral fellowship at the National Institutes of Health. She's published extensively on a broad array of topics in bioethics, and today Dana will be giving a presentation entitled How to Think About Algorithms Informing End-of-Life Decisions. So the game plan is that Dana's going to speak for about 25 minutes, and then we'll have about 30 minutes for questions. If any questions come to mind during her talk, please add them to the Q&A box, and that way Dana can address them during the Q&A period. Okay, over to you, Dana.
Thank you so much, Richard. Let me share my screen. All right. Hopefully now everybody can see the screen. So thank you so much for inviting me. I'm so excited about this practical philosophy series and how to think about different issues that are both practically pressing and philosophically interesting. And so talking to Richard about lots of these topics, we thought that one of the lines of research that might be really interesting to spark a conversation is thinking about how algorithms can inform and whether they should inform end-of-life decision-making. As Richard said, I'm Dana Howard. I'm an assistant professor in the Division of Bioethics in the Department of Biomedical Education and Anatomy in the College of Medicine and in the Department of Philosophy in the College of Arts and Sciences. And I love my position because I get to do practical philosophy. And so, one of the things that I really feel privileged to be able to do is basically sometimes be the only philosopher in the room in large team science projects where we're thinking about sort of the concerns of patients, of physicians, of researchers, and we're trying to institute different policies, both institutionally and also in our research. So a big line of sort of methodological thinking for me is how does practice and philosophical inquiry inform each other? So what can philosophical questions contribute to practice? And what can practice contribute to philosophical inquiry? And we're going to start with the second question about practice to highlight the ways in which I think that when we really pay attention to the practices in our everyday life, it actually really does make our philosophical investigations way more interesting. All right, so here's the example, okay? The trouble with end-of-life decision-making. For those physicians in the audience, for those family members who have had to be surrogates for loved ones, for those thinking about it in their future, everybody knows this is a super complicated issue. And here is a sad fact. Okay, it's likely that some of the most important decisions involving your medical care will not be made by you. So when it comes to decision-making in the medical setting, half of treatment decisions in nursing homes, 3/4 of treatment decisions in ICUs involve patients who cannot either presently or no longer make medical decisions for themselves. So it's going to require other people to make decisions on your behalf. And that is really hard for others to do. So there's been these tools that have been tried to be implemented to support this decision-making process, right? So we all know about advanced directives. The idea of an advanced directive is the patient is able to write in advance what their will and preferences are. And then the surrogate or whoever's making a decision can basically, this is at least how it's pitched, do as the patient says. There's also this institution of appointing a trusted surrogate. And there's a conflict sometimes between the advanced directive and the trusted surrogate, because the pitch for the surrogate is actually to be trusted to do as the patient would have chosen. And then finally, there's this sort of emergent idea that the burden shouldn't only be on the surrogate. There should be this shared decision-making process between clinicians, the surrogate, and the patient to the capacities that they have to figure things out together. And all of these tools are important. They sometimes go against each other, and they sometimes undermine each other, and also they still leave a lot of gaps. So here's just like 2 quick problems about advanced directives in particular. So one problem is only 1 in 3 adults fill one out in the United States. Second problem is, of those who do fill it out, a majority would actually prefer that their trustee have the leeway to override what is explicitly stated in the advanced directive. So I personally don't think that's a problem, but it is a problem in the way in which advanced directives are pitched and the sort of purpose that they're supposed to be used for. So that's sort of a problem with advanced directives. But then when it comes to surrogate decision-making, there's even more problems that emerge. So there's 2 significant challenges to surrogate decision-making. The first is the problem of prediction. Surrogates have a hard time predicting what the patient's preferences actually are. So there's been all these interesting studies where they have the surrogate that has been appointed by the patient. They come to the room, they talk about their advanced care preferences and plans, then they get separated out into separate rooms with different hypothetical medical contexts. The surrogate tries to predict what the patient would have wanted. The patient also tries to predict what they would have wanted in this sort of context. They come back together, and surrogates are only 68% correct, where 50% would have been a coin toss, right? So 68% isn't awesome. Further research on this has shown that actually advanced directives don't seem to improve predictive accuracy. So when you put the surrogates and the patients in the room, they go over the advanced directive, they separate out. It doesn't get much better in terms of predicting predictive accuracy. One thing that is interesting, though, is it does improve the confidence from the patient's perspective in the surrogate's decision-making ability. Finally, further studies have shown that physicians have been found to even be less able to predict patients' treatment preferences than family members. So there's all of these problems about people actually being able to predict what the patient would have wanted when the patient no longer has capacity to make the decisions for themselves. Another really important problem is the burdens. These are hard decisions. People know that they're not necessarily good at them, and the stakes are really high. So it's not surprising that 1/3 of surrogates in the ICU and 4/5 of those who have made end-of-life decisions end up developing symptoms of PTSD. So these are big problems that have yet to be sort of resolved in practice. And so one question is, well, can algorithms help, right? Can predictive analytic tools help us make decisions that honor and or represent patient preferences and values in the medical decision-making process? So just like Amazon can predict the sorts of shoes that you won't want to buy or the movie that you want to watch next, maybe algorithms can help us predict what Uncle Joe would have wanted now that Uncle Joe no longer has the capacity to share those preferences in person. All right, So one thing to highlight is the way in which I've been thinking about algorithmic tools in medicine is not the way in which people tend to think about the use of algorithmic tools in medicine. So there's been a lot of practical implementation and ethical discussion about the use of algorithmic tools in diagnostic aids, like being able to diagnose cancer, right? There's also been more recent uses of AI and algorithmic tools to try and propel forward drug development and research. I think these are super interesting questions, but that's a little bit different than using algorithmic tools as decisional aids for value-based decisions. So the idea isn't, oh, this computer can pick out which mass is a cancer better than the physician. What the tool is actually trying to predict is what the preferences and values of the patient are, right? And I think there's some really interesting and distinctive ethical questions that come out of this specific use and application of algorithmic tools in medicine. And that's what we're going to be talking about today. So it has been, so one tool that has been sort of introduced as a possible support is this idea of a patient preference predictor, which basically makes treatment preference predictions on the basis of the preferences of similar patients in similar circumstances. And as this hasn't been developed yet, it would be very expensive to develop. But one thing that people have also tried to think about is possibly incorporating and supplementing this sort of prediction with information about the patient from their electronic health records, from their online profile, and other digital traces that they may have. So some advocates have sort of called this a kind of digital psychological twin that could be queried in real time when a new medical event comes up to see what the patient would have wanted. Others have called this the autonomy algorithm. I'm happy to take questions and talk about this in the Q&A about how I think about this and what this is doing. But basically, you kind of get the idea, right? So the idea is we have this algorithmic tool that can maybe support surrogates as they're making these decisions. Now, we do have some very coarse population-based models that have been found to be as accurate as surrogates at predicting patient preferences. So for example, this very coarse population model was just basing its predictions on general population preferences. So it didn't even look at distinctive traits or interests or values of the patient themselves, just sort of a larger picture of the population as a whole. So we know, for example, that 75% of adults would not want to be kept alive if they were in a coma with no chance of recovery, right? We also have studies have suggested that most Americans would want treatment even if there was a 1% chance of recovery to an acceptable health state. So knowing these sorts of things and incorporating these kinds of very basic preferences, the algorithm was able to predict as well as surrogates in terms of what a patient's preference would be. And it's suggested that a PPP could also incorporate more personalized characteristics. So there's been a lot of studies about patient preferences. For example, it's been suggested that living alone is associated with a preference for dying in the hospital and for not wanting mechanical ventilation. Daily church attendance and less than weekly contact with friends and family were associated with a preference against palliative drugs that might be life-shortening. And having a personal doctor was associated with greater concern about receiving too much medical treatment, right? So basically, we sort of know that these sorts of features about subpopulations can be incorporated into a PPP and try to make more bespoke predictions about what this particular patient would have wanted. Okay, so that's sort of the idea, right? So let's now get into some of the ethical questions. So a PPP would make treatment predictions not necessarily based on their preferences, but based on the treatment preferences of similar patients in similar circumstances. Demographic characteristics could be part of it. The prognosis could be an important component. Other similarities might actually be pretty surprising. So depending on geographically what part of the United States you are, that can actually have an effect on whether or not you want all measures to be taken at the end of life, right? So these things don't necessarily track your values as much as they're sort of accidents of fortune. But that could also be even more predictive than other things that you do think are really important. For example, that you're a philosopher or a university professor. All right, so one important ethical question that we should think about is, well, what is the appropriate algorithmic model for ethically predicting patient preferences? And one way to sort of get an idea about what different kinds of models there are is we could think about the Pandora model versus the Spotify model. Now they're kind of intermixed and everything's proprietary, so you don't exactly know what's going on. But at the time when they were both sort of in the presented as opposing algorithmic tools, Pandora really pitched itself as this human in the loop model for predicting musical preferences, right? They had this music genome project where each song was analyzed with 400 distinct musical characteristics by a trained musical analyst, right? So there are people that were just ticking boxes about every single song to highlight what are the features that are true of this song. And then there was human in the loop also from the listener end, where you could thumbs up, thumbs down the preferences. So one of the ways in which Pandora really pitched itself is it is this sort of, it is an algorithmic model, but there's a human in a loop in all these different levels. And also for every song, there was an explanation about why this song was picked for you, right? It made sense to the listener. Now, this might not be as predictive as other kinds of models. So, Spotify is a very different sort of model, which is sort of this idea of unsupervised learning. It does not care. Spotify doesn't care about like what the specific musical tones or beats, or influences of a specific song are. Instead, it's content agnostic. What it does is it sort of looks at location data, social media data, listening history, and predicts on the basis of what other people that are like you are listening to, right? So these are very different models, and we could talk about which one, is there one that is preferable to thinking about predicting patient preferences? And when we think about which one is preferable, we're having to think about philosophical questions about, well, what do we want this end-of-life decision-making to be? And what does it actually mean to respect patient preferences when they no longer can articulate them in real time? All right, so that's one of the ways in which the practice informs my philosophy. Another way in which I've been engaged in practical philosophy is actually doing empirical work to see how people actually respond to some of these tools that have been proposed or have been actually implemented. So even if a tool can be developed, would it actually solve the problem that it's supposed to address in practice? I think that's a big question, and I'm not going to be able to answer it in the armchair, but as a philosopher, armed with the ways in which people think about it, that can give me a better sense of what is going on and how to answer those questions. So there has been some research on the possibility of the use of PPPs. So there was one study that was a survey that evaluated patients' views of a PPP, and it found that a majority of patients would support it if it increased predictive accuracy. Another important and interesting and surprising finding from this study was that a majority of patients preferred decision-making procedures that more accurately predicted their treatment preferences over methods that might minimize the stress on their family and loved ones. Okay, so think about that for a second, because I'm going to return to that as an issue soon. All right. So, one of the things when it came to the NIH, I was already thinking about advanced directives and how we can responsibly make decisions on behalf of others. And Dave Wendler, who's a proponent of the PPP, came up to me and wanted to do this collaboration where we did this focus group study. And what we wanted to do was we wanted to not interview or survey patients, but actually the surrogates, right? Because if the surrogates are skeptical of PPP, they may not make use of its predictions in their decision making, regardless of patient endorsement, right? So what we sort of tried to do is we wanted to evaluate the perspective of the surrogate decision makers. We wanted it to be a qualitative analysis using focus groups rather than a survey, because one of the worries that Dave had actually in the previous study was he wasn't sure if people really got what the PPP was supposed to be doing. So this would give participants a more nuanced and sort of complex understanding of the tool. We also thought it was really important to interview experienced surrogates who have already had to make really difficult medical decisions on behalf of a loved one, because they were the ones that recognize the complexity of these decisions, and maybe they also have experienced the emotional burden of making those decisions. And we wanted to make sure that even though it was a focus group, and it was actually a pretty small focus group, we wanted to be a multi-site context. So it was done in 2 university-affiliated hospitals and 2 community hospitals to try and get a more representative population. All right, so 3 themes emerged in the, let me see, I might have, yeah. Okay, 3 themes emerged in the focus group study. The first theme is this idea that I, the surrogate, should be the one to decide whether to use it or not. The second is, well, this is good for others, but not for me. And the third theme is algorithms, yikes. And I'm going to get to sort of each of these ideas. So here's a representative quote for the first theme. It kind of helps to give you a roadmap. It's a starting point. It's not saying it's going to make a decision for you. It's just saying if you need some information to help you to make your decision, you could start here, right? RW, I think, is representative of something that was consensus among all the respondents, supporters and critics alike, which was that if a PPP is developed and if its use increases predictive accuracy, it should be offered to surrogates, but it should be the surrogates and not the preferences of the patient or the preferences of others that should decide how, if at all, a PPP is used in practice. Some worried that mandating the use of a PPP could take the power out of the surrogates in the patient's hands and computerize the decision. And some were concerned that if a surrogate did not have the authority to decide how to use the PPP, it might actually end up being used to deny expensive care to patients who need it. So there were worries about who has authority to use this if it's implemented. The second theme is this idea that, oh, seems great for others, but not for me. So some indicated that they would not use the PPP personally because they felt confident that they knew what the patient wanted. A number of people said this. And this confidence is likely protective, right? Uncertainty regarding which treatments the patient would want is a significant source of stress for these surrogates. The problem is, and we know this is a problem from a lot of behavioral psychology and also some research related to surrogate decision-making, is even surrogates who have known the patient for decades are often mistaken about their loved one's treatment preferences. So I have there's a lot of really interesting consumer research actually about how the longer a couple is together, the worse they are at predicting the preferences of the other person rather than the better. If there are any psychologists in the audience, I would love to pick your brains about why that is. All right, so that, that I think is another interesting theme that I think complicates the picture. And then the third theme is actually, I think, more related to sort of algorithmic injustice and some of these other issues that we've seen elsewhere when we talk about the ethics of the use of algorithms. So I'm going to do, this is a long quote from this participant, but I think it's a really philosophically rich one. My initial reaction was an algorithm, yikes. I think algorithms can be discriminatory and in other ways flawed. There was an algorithm that judges were using to predict whether or not prisoners would commit a crime once they were released. They would spit out this person's characteristics into this algorithm, and the components of the algorithm had to do with things like the relative quality of the people that this person may hang out around with, the person's zip code, things like that that the person really has no control over. But those things were being used to determine his or her fate. And I think that that was wrong. I personally think that it was wrong. And so just that example helps me to consider that the things that go into the algorithm might not be accurate predictors. That's the reason why I sort of have problems with this. And this participant was way more skeptical of predictive algorithms than others in our focus group. And I think she's bringing up a lot of interconnected issues and ethical concerns. So the results from this study, in general, one of the results was surrogates like patients strongly supported the idea of using PPPs to help make treatment decisions for decisionally incapacitated patients. However, patients and surrogates seem to potentially disagree over whose preferences should determine how treatment decisions are made, including whether to use a PPP. And I think one of the things that these kinds of findings are starting to reveal is that there's a fundamental disagreement potentially between patients and surrogates, but also, I think, in the population, a disagreement amongst us regarding what the guiding principles of surrogate decision-making should be. And so given all this sort of practical stuff, how is this informing sort of my philosophical questions? What philosophical questions should we be thinking about that can contribute and sort of benefit improving these kinds of tools if they're developed in practice? So I think that there's going to be a number of key ethical challenges. So one ethical challenge that came up both in the focus group, but also in general thinking about these issues is this worry about alienation. So for predictive accuracy, a PPP may include inputs that do not seem relevant from the patient's or from the surrogate's perspective. What should we do in those sorts of situations? Should we give up on some predictive accuracy to only incorporate the features of the patient that either the patient or the surrogate deems relevant, or should we try and make the most accurate prediction possible? The second ethical challenge is the question of authority. As we saw, there's already a disagreement between the surrogates and the patients. So who should ultimately decide how and if a PPP is used? Recall that patients may prefer processes that are more predictive of their preferences, even if it doesn't minimize surrogate emotional burden. So when these two things conflict, how should things be prioritized? Should we prioritize predictive accuracy? Should we prioritize surrogate burden? Who gets to decide? Another ethical challenge that came up in the sort of final theme is this worry about residual mistrust. So residual mistrust of algorithms due to racial bias and racial targeting in other domains, for example, the criminal justice domain. Maybe they are also seeping into the medical domain. There's also medical mistrust that is reasonable in the medical domain. So this sort of creeping mistrust may actually be a problem for uptake and may marginalize certain populations if it's implemented. There's also the real philosophical question about measurement. Are algorithms actually predicting the right thing? Are they predicting actual preferences of the patient, or just the preferences that the patient is projecting of their own future preferences, right? Before they actually have a medical event. The fifth sort of challenge is the challenge of amplifying injustice. So some predictions may accurately reflect patient preferences, but only due to the fact that the preferences themselves have been developed in unjust circumstances. So we know that racialized minorities like African Americans, immigrant populations, have more medical mistrust of clinicians, and they actually end up preferring all measures to be taken at the end of life. Those are their preferences. Those are reasonable preferences, but sometimes, I mean, one of the sort of, when you actually think about how those preferences come about, those preferences are in response to worries about medical neglect at the end of life, right? So if we think that it's not always the case that, you know, all measures at the end of life is going to contribute to quality care, then some people might be predicted to have certain preferences on the basis of being in a racialized minority, So some of those people might be predicted to have certain preferences that might undermine the quality of their care. All right. And then finally, not only could this potentially amplify injustice, this also could amplify distress. So algorithms may make predictions that go against the surrogate's predictions, especially if they're better at it, right? So how should surrogates choose on such occasions? Even if they, how would this affect their decisional burden of choosing, even if they end up going with their gut, right? So, I mean, bringing in these tools doesn't necessarily minimize surrogate distress. It may actually amplify distress for some members of the population. All right, so those were some like big ethical questions that I have given some of the empirical work that I've done and some of the philosophical work that I've done and others have done. And now I'm excited to hear from you as well.
Thank you, Dana. That was awesome. If you have any questions, feel free to put them in the Q&A box. Let's start with sort of a fairly general question. So, Dana, as you know, there's lots of general debates at the moment about algorithmic fairness. I wonder if you could say a little bit about how the sorts of challenges that you're exploring in your research are related to these broader concerns about algorithmic fairness.
Yeah, thanks. So, I mean, I kind of highlighted a little bit about how I think that so there's algorithmic fairness in criminal justice, in the criminal justice system, and in other ways in which the algorithm is making decisions on the basis of features of the person, demographic features of the person, that have consequences about whether or not they're going to continue to be incarcerated, right? So algorithmic fairness there, I think that there are really, there are huge differences between the ways in which algorithms are used in like the criminal justice context, and how they can be translated into the medical context. In the medical context in general, when it comes to diagnostic worries, the worries are often about misrepresentation and exclusion, right? So in a lot of research, minoritized populations, women, they may be left out of the data sets that are spitting in the algorithms that are being that are teaching the algorithms. And so then they may not benefit, or they may be misdiagnosed, or there might be missed diagnoses, right? And so that problem of exclusion, in some ways, there's still that problem when it comes to predictive algorithms, when it comes with value-based preferences. But I think there are, above all those issues, I guess the idea is, above all these other issues, I think there are very distinctive questions related to what are we even trying to do when we're predicting people's value-based stuff, like their preferences, right? It's not about finding like whether or not the computer can better find a mass
Yeah.
as cancer. It's really more about, I mean, I guess the question is like, what is more predictive, right? Do people actually have these sorts of preferences that are fixed that can actually be predicted in the same way that a cancer can be diagnosed? So those I think are really interesting ethical questions. And there are just issues related to uncertainty that I think are just part of decision making at the end of life that may not be part of decision making in other realms.
Great, thank you. So this has prompted a question that I suspect is prompted by things you said during the talk in thinking about PPPs, how reliable they are, and also the observations you made regarding the perhaps surprising, lack of reliability in some of the studies you cited involving surrogate decision making or surrogate predictions. So it starts as some philosophical questions do with a kind of a supposition. And the supposition's this: suppose that we had good empirical reasons on the basis of studies to date to suppose that PPPs are actually considerably more reliable in predicting patient preferences than selected surrogates are. And I suspect that many people, an obvious question comes to mind is, well, why not leave out the surrogate? Why not just do it with these PPPs if they're so good about it? And if you're looking for an analog, maybe what the person has in mind is, well, if you found out that when it came to identifying the location of a mass, AIs or computer systems are much more reliable than clinicians, wouldn't we turn it over to the computational systems to do it more reliably? So just wondered, I suspect this is a question that comes to many people's minds. So
it's a question and it's a position that many people have advocated, right? So there has been just people that, there has been philosophers that have been advocating getting rid of, not only because surrogates are so bad at it, right? But also they feel bad when they do it. It's actually really it's a really difficult position to be put in. Maybe we should just go into lean into AI, right? So that has been a position that some have advocated for. And I'm open to that. I came into this project being very skeptical of using algorithmic tools in this decision-making process. But the more I've been thinking about it, the more I actually think that well, what if instead of an advanced directive that focuses solely on preferences for medical care, we can have an advanced directive that is about the process of decision making. And maybe some people really do only care about this sort of prediction, right? And they get to decide that that's what they want and they don't want their family members to be involved. But then other people that want their family members involved, maybe then there is this sort of important negotiation process where they can sort of figure out what is a decision-making procedure that works. And I mean, in some ways, new models of advanced directives have been moving in that way. There have been some sort of process questions that are added to it. And I think that that would be a really important. So I'm open to some people choosing to just not have their family members be part of it. But that also, I mean, one of the questions that we should think about is, well, what are the goals of end of life decision making? Is it only about respecting the preferences of the patient? Or is there a legitimate concern for families and surrogates about their well-being? And if you're completely shut out of the decision-making process for a loved one, that could be very disempowering. And from a utilitarian perspective, it could be really bad for society if people feel really horrible about the ways in which their loved ones' medical decision-making was made at the end of their life.
Right, we have a long list of questions that are a significant list of questions, and I hope you don't mind me mentioning your names as I ask them. So this one comes from Barbara Webster, and she says, "I can see how one's background, for example, socioeconomic level, race, religion, education, and so on, would affect the outcome of the algorithm. How many data points would have to go into developing this ability to predict?" So I take it it's a question about the nature of the models.
Yeah, and so there's been so one of the things that we've started sort of learning from the literature related to preferences is um, there is actually really surprising correlations
Hmm.
between some features of a person and what their medical preferences are that have less to do with their values and their identities, right? And so, and you can imagine if you want to go full on thinking about uh, if you want to really sort of harness the power of artificial intelligence,
Hmm.
and you are going to have to be open to a lot of different kinds of data points, and for there to be a little bit, I mean, a black box, right? It's not going to be clear how certain correlations are made, or even what is it about a person's um, data set that makes the prediction like the prediction that it is. So those are big worries about sort of as we get closer to predictive, like if we care so much about predictive accuracy, we may
Hmm.
want to harness as much data points as possible. But if we care about predictive accuracy that is constrained by the values that the patients and their family members care about, it
Hmm.
might not be as predictive, but it has an explanation behind it, and it would require fewer data points, if that makes sense.
Right. So it gets into questions about the transparency of AI systems, amongst other things.
Yeah.
Right. This is another question. Thank you very much for the question and thanks for the answer. So this is a question from Melissa Wiles. She writes, "If I understand correctly the point about the ethical challenge of measurement that you proposed, the potential issue is that it's difficult even for patients themselves to project their future preferences before they actually arrive at the moment when these difficult decisions are necessary. Does that have to do with the way that emotions come into play when one's thinking only theoretically about a situation as opposed to actually experiencing it? Is there a way to take the emotional dimension into account in the development of these predictive algorithms?" Terrific question.
This is like a question that is close to
Yeah.
my heart, Melissa. So
Right.
thank you so much for asking it. So some of my other work has been on transformative experiences and how we make decisions when we know that some of the choices that you make can actually really change your values in the future. And you can potentially even predict that those changes are going to happen, but you don't understand why they're going to happen. And you don't, and you're in some ways alienated from those changes. And one of the things that I've been thinking about a lot is, well, how do predicting certain emotional states actually help us to connect to it? But so Melissa, this is like, these are ethical issues that I think are so important, and they're philosophically really, I mean, they're exciting philosophical topics for future study. So that's so one thing to say. There has been, when it comes to sort of these studies related to patients and surrogates being able to predict preferences in particular, there has been this real worry about offline versus online reasoning. So offline reasoning is the reasoning that isn't in the present and you're just sort of projecting. And there's a question about whether or not the patients themselves are really predicting what their preferences are in any sort of accurate way, whether there is some sort of fixed thing to predict at this given moment, right? So there's all these sorts of, I think, really important questions that are there. One way in which some of the studies have tried to address this is they've tried to be more focused on, like, they've talked about like done the same studies with dialysis patients about end stage renal failure. So they've been trying to find ways in which people already experience some of the features of the medical complexity that are going to have to be decided later. But even there, I think Melissa's point is really well taken, which is, well, what are we really predicting? Are we just predicting what the patient sitting in this room next to me is predicting for themselves?
So this is really a follow-up. So this is me, and I apologize for inserting myself. But do you get a sense of what the current state of empirical research on these issues about prediction uh, offline, when, let's say, you're sitting there and you're not under time constraints, none of the problematic emotional factors are playing out, as opposed to the decisions that people ultimately make under, as it were, online decision making, when they're actually under time constraints and the salient features of that they're being asked to envisage making judgments about are actually operative. It seems to me that that's a kind of contrast that could occur in ever so many cases, many of which will have nothing to do with end of life decision making.
Yeah, I mean, it's a huge concern. So one thing recently, initially when the PPP was first proposed, the idea was you'd have this massive survey.
Mhm.
And you just get all this data and you'd find it from the data, right?
Right.
More recently, there was this last year, there was the PPPP proposed, which is like one extra P, I think it's for personalized. And the idea is to use large language models to
Yes, that's
really scrape all of this information. So not to do the survey, which is like in some ways like very offline, but to do all this other sort of scraping of someone's data to like try and predict more how they act normally and predict what their preferences would be. The thing is like people just don't, there's not that much data about medical, like the decision making process that people are thinking about. You have blog posts, but even like electronic health records are written by the clinicians. They're not written by the patients themselves. So I actually think that this is a place where there's just very little data
okay.
about what people would actually be deciding in real time. And it's one of the places where I think that maybe there's just not enough data to be able to make predictions, even if there was a thing to predict.
Got it. Okay, thank you. So the next question is from actually a professor of psychology, Alex Petrov. He's a cognitive psychologist. And so I think it's a psychologist question, Alex. Are are there studies of are there studies of the test retest reliability of the patient's preferences or surrogate preferences? This would provide useful context for evaluating the 68% accuracy of surrogates.
Uh,
So,
that is great. I have not seen any test
right.
retest
It's a good
reliability.
question.
So that's a
Yeah,
great question.
yeah,
And yeah, I mean, it would be a great thing to study, actually.
right.
Yeah,
So that would be something actually I would be interested to find out about as well.
yeah.
So here's a question from Amy Schuster. What are we to make of the phenomena of miswanting that psychological research substantiated in weighing the preferences of actual patients and their surrogates? So is the notion of miswanting clear there?
Maybe Amy can say a little bit more about miswanting. I'm not aware of the research.
Yeah, and I'll pop in here real quick. Amy, I'm gonna actually allow you to turn your mic on real quick so that you can add some more context around that.
Thank you, Amy. Thank you, Alex.
Hi, yeah. As I understand it, miswanting is people will predict what will make them happy, and then like later on when something actually occurs, it doesn't make them, quite as happy, or they think it will make them sad, but it doesn't make them quite as sad. So
Yeah.
there's some lack of prediction about people about their future selves, if I've got that right.
Yeah, no, that's great. Thanks. Yeah. So, I mean, there's a lot of studies related to like disability, right? Where people predict that this is like, or having like, what do you call it? Like a PVAC, like that's going to like really change your life. And then it doesn't, right? So people's like welfare predictions are like always really dire when it comes to certain medical transformations that end up having, there's always like, sort of a dip. I think that's a huge important question, and I think that this is sort of an issue of the it highlights both this question and the last question highlight potential limits. Actually, the last three questions highlight potential limitations for the psychological like studies or the sort of clinical studies related to surrogate prediction power. And I don't know, and it's something that I think is really an important, the fact that people predict that things are going to be worse for them, I think is an important thing to really bring back into the shared decision making sort of conversation. And yeah, I'll end there to have more questions.
Great. Thank you, Amy. And here's a question from Tina Badine. So great presentation, Professor Howard. I wondered if this type of model could be useful for other patients who lack capacity and maybe even lack a surrogate, such as delirium or dementia. Also, I saw a recent article that AI was more reliable than clinicians at predicting time of patient's death. Lots to consider with these algorithms. Great question, Tina.
Yeah, thank you. And yeah, I think that when it comes to, so I am very worried. So one of my other sort of research, I've been thinking a lot. So a lot of my research is about making decisions on behalf of others, right? And some of it is related to end of life care where people lose capacity. But I think that we need to be very careful about the lessons that are learned there and translate it to other people who are incapacitated or who are or other people who are either temporarily incapacitated, like in the ICU, or people who just have intellectual disabilities or communication disabilities. And one thing that I'm worried about is sort of the ways in which, if we only use the model of the sort of dementia patient, which is like the way in which Ronald Dworkin has used, that's always how we think about decisional capacity. There's this idea of there was once this person with full capacity, and now how to respect their like will now that they no longer have full capacity. And I actually, a lot of the work that I've been doing, just thinking about what respect means for decision making for people that have marginal capacity or have been determined to lack decisional capacity, is this idea that you could still insult people's agential capacities with, even if they never had capacity, full legally recognized capacity to make decisions in the first place. So this is really focused on end of life decision making and people who really can't communicate their preferences. And I think that there's other really important ethical questions related to whether some of the lessons can translate and how AI can be used in these other cases.
Good, thank you. So this is a final question from, and I apologize if I pronounce your name wrong, Jacob Alay. And it's a question that concerns, as it were, how the issues that you're raising interact with concerns about disparities and accessibility to technology. And the question's this: one of the central problems in digital technology is that it's generally not universally accessible. For example, folks not fluent in English have higher barriers to computer literacy across the planet. How can we ensure that pre-existing barriers to healthcare and computer access do not apply to surrogates using an end-of-life algorithm?
Yeah,
Thanks for that.
yeah, it's a great question. And I mean, one of the sort of issues that I brought up in the ethical sort of the 6-point ethical thing is the ways in which, and this is an issue related to algorithmic injustice in general, the ways in which these tools, if they actually work, right, who are they going to be working for and who's going to be left out, right? And I think that that's a huge worry that we should have as theorists and policymakers it was clear that that was a worry that the surrogates had. And one of the main concerns that they had actually was the use of these kinds of tools to cut down the decision-making time between clinicians and families about the end-of-life care for their patients. So basically undermining giving people the resources to have the health literacy they need to make the informed decision on behalf of their loved one. And they were also worried that insurance companies were going to use this to deny care. So these are like huge worries that we definitely need to think about moving forward if we decide that this is something that we should try and develop and implement.
Thank you very much, Dana. I think that's a good place to stop. And thank you all for being in attendance. I look forward to seeing you all on February 29th, when Professor Norris Turner will discuss issues to do with civil discourse on campus.
Thank you, everyone, for the great questions.